The lake country of Naboo had always been a place where time seemed to slow, where the universe's chaos faded into background noise beneath the sound of water lapping against ancient stone, and the wind moving through meadows that bloomed in colors too vivid to seem natural. Padmé Amidala stood on the balcony of Varikino, the lakeside villa that had witnessed the beginning of her forbidden love, and watched the sun descend toward the horizon with the slow inevitability of fate itself. Her hand rested on her swollen belly, feeling the twins move within her, their presence in the Force, something she couldn't name but could sense nonetheless. Two bright sparks of life that carried both her determination and their father's dangerous intensity. She was 7 months pregnant, though the flowing gowns and elegant draping she wore concealed the truth from all but those closest to her. The secret had grown heavier with each passing day, not just in her body but in her heart, the weight of deception pressing down on her with suffocating persistence. 3 years of war had aged Padmé in ways that transcended physical measure. When she looked in the mirror now, she saw someone who had witnessed too much suffering, made too many compromises, watched democracy erode beneath the weight of emergency powers that were supposed to be temporary but had calcified into permanence. The young queen, who had liberated her planet from the Trade Federation's occupation, seemed like a different person, a girl who had believed in the absolute power of moral clarity and just action. The senator she had become understood that the galaxy was painted in shades of grey far more often than black and white, that good intentions could pave roads to destinations as terrible as any evil deliberately chosen. The Clone Wars had transformed the Republic into something she barely recognized. Chancellor Palpatine, who had been her loyal advisor during the Naboo crisis, who had seemed a grandfatherly figure dedicated to peace and democracy, had accumulated powers that would have been unthinkable a decade ago. The Senate, once a place of vibrant debate and principled opposition, had become a rubber stamp for executive decisions, the representatives more concerned with maintaining their own positions than defending the values they claimed to serve. Military spending had eclipsed social programs. Surveillance had become normalized. Dissent was increasingly equated with treason. And through it all, Palpatine's influence had grown like a shadow lengthening at sunset. His emergency powers expanded with each new crisis. His term extended indefinitely because changing leadership during wartime was too dangerous to contemplate. Padmé had fought against this tide with every tool democracy provided. She had organized opposition blocs, written legislation to curtail executive overreach, given speeches that called her fellow senators to remember their principles and their duty to the people they represented rather than the power structures they served. But for every small victory she achieved, the erosion continued. Systems that had taken centuries to build were being dismantled in months. Precedents broken so regularly that precedent itself no longer seemed to matter. She felt like someone trying to hold back the ocean with her bare hands, watching the waves crash over her again and again, while she stood her ground, even though the ground itself was washing away beneath her feet. Her marriage to Anakin Skywalker had been the one bright constant in these dark years, though it too carried complications that threatened to overwhelm them both. They had married in secret on Naboo 3 years ago, a ceremony witnessed only by droids, their vows spoken in defiance of both the Jedi code that forbade attachments and the political expectations that demanded she remain unencumbered by personal relationships that could compromise her judgment. The secrecy had seemed romantic at first, stolen moments made more precious by their forbidden nature, meetings in her apartment high above Coruscant's glittering cityscape, where they could pretend the galaxy's problems didn't exist for a few precious hours. But secrecy was a poison that corrupted what it was meant to protect. Every public interaction with Anakin required careful calculation, measured distance, ensuring that their body language and eye contact revealed nothing of the intimacy they shared in private. Every absence required cover stories and alibis. Every communication had to be screened for surveillance, coded in language that wouldn't betray their connection if intercepted. The constant deception wore on Padmé's conscience, making her feel like a hypocrite who demanded transparency from her government while hiding the most important truth of her own life. She told herself it was necessary, that their love was worth protecting, that the rules forbidding their marriage were unjust, and therefore breaking them was not only acceptable, but morally correct. But justification and peace of mind were not the same thing, and she found herself lying awake at night wondering when the secret would finally collapse and destroy everything they had built. Anakin had changed during the war years, his transformation both impressive and deeply troubling. He had become a hero, the chosen one living up to at least some of his prophesied potential, leading clone troopers to victory after victory, his tactical brilliance and force powers making him perhaps the most effective general in the entire Republic military. The clones loved him, would follow him into any danger, spoke his name with reverence and loyalty that went beyond mere respect for rank. His reputation spread across the galaxy until even those who knew nothing else about the Jedi knew the name Anakin Skywalker. The hero with no fear, the warrior who turned impossible odds into victories through sheer will and power. But victory in war required qualities that corroded the soul. Anakin had learned to kill without hesitation, to make calculations that weighed lives against strategic objectives, to function in an environment where compassion could mean disaster and ruthlessness meant survival. The Jedi Code preached detachment and serenity, but war demanded passion and aggression. Anakin had always struggled with the Code's restrictions, his emotions running too hot, and his attachments too fierce for the traditional Jedi path. War had given those qualities an outlet, a context where his intensity was asset rather than liability. But it had also fed his darker impulses, the anger and fear and possessiveness that the Jedi Masters had always worried would lead him astray. Padmé saw the change in his eyes when he returned from campaigns. Something had hardened there, a capacity for violence that went beyond necessary force into territory that frightened her even as she tried to deny her fear. He spoke less about ending the war through negotiation and more about defeating the Separatists utterly, crushing them so completely that they could never threaten the Republic again. His distrust of the Jedi Council had grown into something approaching contempt, his complaints about their caution and politics becoming more frequent and bitter. He had begun to speak admiringly of Chancellor Palpatine's decisive leadership, comparing it favorably to what he saw as the Council's paralysis and moral equivocation. Most troubling were the stories she heard from other sources, reports that Anakin sometimes dismissed as enemy propaganda, but that came from too many directions to be entirely fabricated. Prisoners executed after surrender, civilian casualties explained away as necessary collateral damage, interrogation techniques that crossed lines the Jedi supposedly held sacred. When she asked him about these incidents, he became defensive, explaining that war required harsh choices, that she didn't understand the reality of combat, that the rules that applied in Senate chambers didn't function in battle zones where hesitation meant death for the troops under his command. His justifications made sense in their own logic, but they also revealed a moral framework that had shifted in ways that made Padmé's heart ache with worry. Their time together had become increasingly precious and increasingly fraught. When Anakin was on Coruscant, they stole hours in her apartment, physical intimacy providing temporary escape from the pressures crushing them both. But even their lovemaking had changed, acquiring an edge of desperation, as though they were both trying to hold on to something that was slipping away despite their efforts. Afterward, lying in darkness with his arms around her and the city lights painting patterns on the ceiling, they would talk about the future they dreamed of sharing. When the war ended, they would leave public life, find somewhere peaceful where they could raise their family openly, where Anakin could leave the Jedi, and Padmé could abandon politics, and they could finally just be two people in love, without the weight of the galaxy on their shoulders. But these dreams felt increasingly hollow, fantasies they recited to comfort themselves, rather than plans they genuinely believed would materialize. The war showed no signs of ending. If anything, it was escalating, the separatist forces growing more coordinated, the Republic's military grinding through resources and lives at an unsustainable rate. Palpatine's emergency powers had been extended again, the sunset clause that was supposed to force their expiration postponed indefinitely, and Anakin was becoming more entangled with the Chancellor, spending time with Palpatine that made Padmé deeply uneasy, even though she couldn't articulate exactly why. The Chancellor had always been kind to her, supportive of her political career, seemingly invested in mentoring Anakin toward his potential. But something in the way Palpatine looked at Anakin reminded Padmé of a puppeteer examining strings, calculating which to pull to achieve desired movements. When Padmé discovered she was pregnant, the emotion was complex beyond simple description. Joy at the new lives growing within her, terror at the complications they represented, love for these children she hadn't yet met but already would die to protect. She told Anakin in her apartment one evening, watching his face cycle through shock and fear and wonder and fierce protective determination. He held her as though she were made of glass, his hands trembling against her back, his voice breaking as he spoke of being a father, of having a family, of the future taking concrete shape rather than remaining abstract dream. But beneath the joy, Padmé felt the undercurrent of fear that had become Anakin's constant companion, fear that he would lose her as he had lost his mother, fear that he wasn't ready to be a father, fear that the galaxy would somehow take this happiness away before he could fully claim it. The pregnancy had to remain secret, the deception now carrying stakes beyond their careers and reputations. If the Jedi discovered that Anakin had violated his vows so fundamentally, he would be expelled from the Order at minimum, possibly facing charges for betraying the code during wartime. If the Senate learned that Padmé had been conducting a secret marriage while serving as a senator, the scandal could destroy not just her career but the progressive coalition she had spent years building, giving ammunition to those who wanted to dismiss her as hypocrite and liar. So Padmé hid the pregnancy behind flowing gowns and strategic scheduling, reducing her public appearances, claiming illness and fatigue when her condition made presence impossible. But secrets this significant had a way of creating their own gravity, pulling circumstances and attention toward themselves despite all efforts at concealment. Padmé could feel the suspicion growing among her staff and colleagues, the questions they were too polite or too afraid to ask directly. Her handmaidens, who had served her since her days as queen, surely knew the truth or at least suspected it, but they maintained the pretense of ignorance out of loyalty and love. Senator Bail Organa of Alderaan, one of her closest political allies, looked at her with concern that suggested he had deduced more than she had confirmed. Even C-3PO, her protocol droid, seemed confused by the changes in her schedule and habits, though his programming prevented him from drawing the conclusions that would have been obvious to an organic mind. Anakin's behavior became increasingly erratic as the pregnancy progressed. He was having nightmares, visions that woke him gasping and drenched in sweat, images of Padmé dying in childbirth that he described with such visceral clarity that they seemed more like premonitions than dreams. Padmé tried to comfort him, to explain that childbirth was safer now than at any point in galactic history, that they would have the finest medical care available, that his fears were natural but ultimately baseless. But Anakin's certainty couldn't be shaken. He had dreamed of his mother's suffering before she died, had arrived too late to save her despite racing across the galaxy. He believed these new visions carried the same prophetic weight, that Padmé was doomed unless he found some way to prevent the future he saw approaching with terrible inevitability. His obsession with preventing her death began to consume him. He spoke less about the war or politics and more about power, about abilities that could transcend normal limitations, about techniques that might allow someone to prevent death itself. When Padmé asked where these ideas came from, he became evasive, mentioning ancient Jedi texts and conversations with Chancellor Palpatine. The mention of Palpatine made Padmé's unease sharpen into alarm. What was the Chancellor telling her husband? What kind of counsel was he providing that focused on death and power rather than peace and acceptance? She asked Anakin directly to stop spending so much time with Palpatine, to focus on his Jedi duties and their family rather than the Chancellor's mentorship. But her request only made Anakin defensive, sparking an argument about trust and support that left them both wounded and distant. The war's end came suddenly, though not in the way anyone had anticipated. General Grievous, the Separatist military commander, was killed on Utapau by Obi-Wan Kenobi, his death seeming to signal the conflict's final phase. Anakin returned to Coruscant from the Outer Rim, his mission to defeat Count Dooku accomplished. Though he spoke little about the details, something haunted in his eyes that suggested the victory had cost him in ways he couldn't articulate. Padmé met him in her apartment, grateful beyond words to have him back, to hold him and feel his solid presence rather than worrying about him light years away facing dangers she couldn't imagine. But Anakin was different, changed in fundamental ways that went beyond the normal impact of combat and stress. He seemed simultaneously more powerful and more fragile, as though something inside him had cracked, and the energy pouring through the fracture was both illuminating and destructive. He held her too tightly, kissed her with desperation rather than passion, spoke to her belly as though trying to memorize the sound of his own voice for children who might never hear it. When she asked what was wrong, he deflected, claiming exhaustion and the accumulated strain of 3 years at war. But Padmé knew him too well to be fooled. Something had happened. Something that had shaken him to his core. The following days unfolded with the disorienting speed of a nightmare where the dreamer knows they're asleep but can't force themselves awake. Chancellor Palpatine addressed the Senate, announcing that the Jedi had attempted to assassinate him, that they had revealed themselves as traitors plotting to overthrow the Republic and establish their own dictatorship. The claim was so absurd, so contrary to everything Padmé knew about the Jedi Order, that her first response was dismissive laughter. But the laughter died in her throat as Palpatine continued, as security footage played showing Jedi Masters attacking the Chancellor in his own office, as the Senate's reaction shifted from shock to rage to bloodlust with terrifying rapidity. Palpatine declared himself Emperor, transforming the Republic into the first galactic empire with the stated purpose of ensuring security and stability in the aftermath of Jedi betrayal. The Senate, cowed and complicit, approved the transformation with thunderous applause that echoed through the chamber like the sound of democracy dying. Padmé stood in her Senate pod, tears streaming down her face, watching centuries of Republican government collapse in minutes because fear had overcome principle and ambition had murdered conscience. She looked around at her colleagues, these men and women who had spoken so eloquently about freedom and justice, and saw only cowardice and opportunism, beings willing to trade liberty for the promise of safety and the maintenance of their own positions. The purge of the Jedi began immediately. Order 66, a protocol apparently embedded in the clone troopers' genetic programming, turned the Republic's army against their Jedi generals in simultaneous betrayals across the galaxy. Masters who had led clones to victory after victory were gunned down by the troops they had trusted, shot in the back during battle, or executed in their meditation chambers, or hunted through city streets by soldiers who had been brothers in arms moments before. The Jedi Temple on Coruscant burned, smoke rising from its spires in a column visible across half the planet. The sanctuary that had stood for millennia reduced to a tomb in a single night. Padmé tried desperately to reach Anakin, to confirm he was safe, to understand what was happening, but he didn't respond to her messages, his comlink silent, his presence in the Force, something she could almost feel but couldn't quite touch. She sent C-3PO and R2-D2 to search for information, contacted what few allies she still trusted, tried to piece together truth from the propaganda and panic flooding the HoloNet. Captain Typho, her head of security, urged her to leave Coruscant immediately, to return to Naboo where her safety could be better ensured and where the new Empire's reach was not yet absolute. But she refused to go without knowing what had happened to her husband. The truth arrived in fragments, each piece more devastating than the last. Anakin had led the 501st Legion's attack on the Jedi Temple. He had been seen entering the temple with clone troopers at his back, his lightsaber ignited, his face a mask of determination. Witnesses spoke of screaming from inside the temple, of young Jedi trying to escape and being cut down, of smoke and fire and carnage that defied comprehension. The reports couldn't be accurate. They had to be exaggerations or lies or mistakes of identity. Anakin was a Jedi. He was a hero. He was the father of her children and the man she loved. He couldn't possibly have done what these reports claimed. Bail Organa confirmed what Padmé couldn't accept. He had been at the temple in the aftermath, had seen the bodies, had barely escaped with his own life when clone troopers opened fire on his speeder. The Jedi were dead or scattered, the Order effectively destroyed, and Anakin Skywalker had been at the center of the slaughter. When Padmé demanded to know how Bail could be certain, he showed her security footage recovered from the temple systems, images too grainy to make out details but clear enough to show a figure in Jedi robes moving through the temple with a blue lightsaber, younglings falling before his blade, their small bodies crumpling in corridors built to shelter them. Padmé's mind rejected what her eyes showed her. There had to be an explanation. Anakin was being controlled somehow, manipulated by the Sith that Obi-Wan had mentioned in rare conversations about ancient enemies the Jedi thought extinct but feared had returned. Or he was acting under orders, some terrible necessity that she didn't understand but that would make sense if she knew all the context. Or the footage was fabricated, Palpatine's agents creating false evidence to frame Anakin for crimes he hadn't committed. The alternative was too terrible to contemplate. The man she loved transformed into a monster who murdered children, the father of her unborn twins revealing himself as something evil beyond redemption. She had to see him. Had to hear the truth from his own mouth. Had to look in his eyes and know with absolute certainty what he had become. Padmé discovered through her remaining intelligence network that Anakin had been sent to Mustafar, a volcanic mining world in the Outer Rim where the Separatist leadership had fled in the war's final days. She prepared her ship for immediate departure, overriding Captain Typho's objections, refusing security escorts, taking only her droids, and the desperate hope that somehow this nightmare would make sense when she confronted him directly. Obi-Wan Kenobi found her as she prepared to leave, the Jedi Master appearing at her apartment like a ghost from the world that had been destroyed. He looked shattered, his eyes red from smoke and grief, his robes stained with ash and blood not his own. He confirmed everything that Padmé had been told, and more. Anakin had fallen to the dark side, corrupted by Palpatine, who had revealed himself as the Sith Lord the Jedi had been hunting for years. Anakin had helped murder Mace Windu, had led the temple attack, had been granted the Sith name Darth Vader as reward for his betrayal. Obi-Wan was going to Mustafar to confront his former Padawan, to stop him before more damage could be done, to end what he had failed to prevent through all their years together. Padmé listened to Obi-Wan's words as though hearing them from a great distance, her mind struggling to integrate information that contradicted everything she thought she knew. But even as part of her screamed denial, another part recognized truth in what Obi-Wan was saying. She had seen the changes in Anakin, the growing darkness, the willingness to justify ends by means that grew progressively more brutal. She had ignored the warning signs because she loved him, because she couldn't imagine existing without him, because acknowledging his corruption would require acknowledging her own failure to prevent or even recognize it fully. Love had blinded her not to who Anakin was but to what he was becoming, and now that transformation was complete. She told Obi-Wan she was going to Mustafar, that she had to speak with Anakin herself, that perhaps she could reach him in ways a Jedi Master could not. Obi-Wan's expression combined pity and resignation. He asked if he could come with her, to be present for the confrontation, to end Vader if Padmé's attempt at redemption failed. She wanted to refuse, to deny him access to this final meeting between husband and wife. But she also understood that Obi-Wan was right, that Anakin might be beyond words now, that someone needed to be prepared to do what love couldn't allow. She agreed to let him accompany her, though he would remain hidden in the ship until she had attempted to reach the man she had married. The journey to Mustafar passed in a haze of emotional numbness. Padmé sat in her ship's cabin, hands resting on her swollen belly, feeling the twins move inside her with the innocent trust that their mother would protect them from any harm. What would she tell these children about their father? That he had been a hero who fell, that he had been a monster who briefly pretended to be a man, that she had loved him despite, or perhaps because of the darkness she had sensed in him from the beginning, drawn to his intensity even when that intensity became dangerous. The questions had no good answers, only painful recognition that her children would grow up knowing their father as history's villain, rather than the complicated, passionate, damaged person she had known. Mustafar emerged from hyperspace like a vision of hell given form. The volcanic world glowed red-orange against the black of space, its atmosphere thick with ash and toxic gases, its surface covered in lava flows that carved through black rock in patterns that suggested veins in a dying body. Padmé's ship descended through clouds that smelled of sulfur and burning metal, landing at a mining facility where separatist ships sat abandoned, their crews either fled or dead. The heat hit her like a physical force when the boarding ramp lowered, the air so hot it hurt to breathe, the ground radiating warmth that penetrated the soles of her shoes. Anakin was waiting on the landing platform, his black robes stark against the orange glow of lava rivers visible in the distance. He looked different, his face harder, his eyes carrying a yellow tint that sent ice through Padmé's veins despite the heat. This was not the man who had held her tenderly just days ago. This was someone wearing her husband's face, something cold and terrible that looked at her with possession rather than love. But when he spoke her name, when his expression softened slightly at seeing her, Padmé felt a flicker of hope. Maybe he was still in there. Maybe she could still reach him. She walked toward him, her hands outstretched in supplication and love, her voice breaking as she asked him what he had done, begging him to tell her the reports were wrong, that he hadn't murdered Jedi and children, that he was still the good man she had married. Anakin's response chilled her more than any denial could have. He didn't refute the accusations. He justified them. The Jedi had betrayed the Republic, had tried to take over, had stood in the way of peace. He had done what was necessary. He had saved democracy by destroying its enemies, and now he had power sufficient to prevent her death, to keep her safe, to ensure their family could be together forever. His words made no sense. A twisted logic where murder became salvation and tyranny masqueraded as peace. Padmé tried to make him see reason, explaining that Palpatine had manipulated him, that the Jedi hadn't betrayed anything, that the Republic they had known was gone and wouldn't return through more violence. She begged him to come away with her, to leave this place, to run somewhere the Empire couldn't find them, and try to build some kind of life from the ruins of their dreams. But Anakin heard only rejection in her words, only refusal to support the path he had chosen. His face hardened again, the yellow tint in his eyes intensifying. Then Obi-Wan emerged from the ship, having heard enough, unable to remain hidden while his former apprentice raved about power and destiny. Anakin's expression transformed from hardness to rage in an instant. Padmé had brought his enemy to kill him. She had betrayed him, just like everyone else. She had chosen the Jedi over her husband, had taken Obi-Wan's side against him. The accusations were madness, paranoid delusion born from dark side corruption. Padmé tried to explain, tried to reach him, but Anakin was beyond hearing. He reached out through the Force, his hand closing in a grasping gesture, and Padmé felt her throat constrict as invisible pressure crushed her windpipe. She couldn't breathe. The world spun as oxygen deprivation made her vision tunnel. She clawed at her throat uselessly, trying to pull away hands that weren't physically present. The twins kicked frantically inside her, distressed by their mother's distress, their Force sensitivity making them aware that something was terribly wrong. She saw Anakin's face swimming before her, saw the rage and betrayal and hurt twisted into something ugly and unrecognizable. This was how she would die, killed by the man she loved, proving his visions true not through fate but through his own actions, creating the future he feared. Obi-Wan's shout broke Anakin's concentration. Padmé collapsed to the platform, gasping for air, her hands instinctively protecting her belly. She heard Obi-Wan and Anakin shouting at each other, accusations and grief made verbal, but the words blurred together into noise. The physical pain of the Force choke was already fading, but something else was breaking inside her, something that went beyond injury into a wound, the spirit rather than the body. The man she had loved was gone, replaced by something that would rather kill her than lose her. The father of her children had become their greatest threat. The future they had dreamed together had died, and she was watching its corpse breathe and move and speak with a dead man's voice. She heard lightsabers ignite, the distinctive snap hiss followed by the hum of blades held in guard positions. She tried to rise, to stop them, to prevent the inevitable, but her body wouldn't cooperate, strength draining from her limbs as though the Force choke had severed something vital. She managed to lift her head enough to see Anakin and Obi-Wan begin their duel, master against student, brother against brother, their blades meeting in sparks and fury. Then darkness crept in from the edges of her vision, consciousness slipping away despite her efforts to maintain it. The last thing Padmé Amidala saw before unconsciousness claimed her was the man she loved trying to kill the man who had trained him, two figures silhouetted against rivers of lava, engaged in a battle that would determine the galaxy's fate, but had already claimed her soul as casualty. She woke in darkness, the sound of medical droids humming around her, the smell of antiseptic and recycled air replacing Mustafa's sulphurous stench. Her throat ached, her body felt simultaneously heavy and insubstantial, as though she had become untethered from physical reality. Most alarming, she felt empty, the presence of the twins within her suddenly absent in a way that made panic surge through her system. She tried to sit up, tried to call out, but her voice emerged as barely a whisper, and her body refused to obey commands. A medical droid appeared in her vision, its optical sensors glowing softly in the dim light. It informed her in the soothing tones programmed for patient care that she was on Polis Massa, a remote asteroid colony with advanced medical facilities. She had been unconscious for several hours. Her injuries from the assault were not severe but had triggered complications with her pregnancy. The medical team had been forced to deliver the twins prematurely to save both her life and theirs. She had given birth to a boy and a girl. Both were alive and stable, small but healthy, their life signs strong. Padmé processed this information with a mind that felt wrapped in cotton, each thought moving slowly through consciousness, thick with shock and medication. She had given birth. She was a mother. Her children were alive. The relief should have been overwhelming, joy sufficient to eclipse all other emotions, but instead she felt only vast emptiness, a hollow space where her connection to Anakin had resided. That bond had been severed on Mustafar as surely as a lightsaber cutting through flesh. The man she had loved was gone. The father of her children had become something monstrous, and she was alive to witness the aftermath, to carry forward the burden of memory and grief, and the terrible knowledge of what love could become when twisted by fear. She asked the droid about Obi-Wan, her voice barely functional. The droid confirmed that Master Kenobi had brought her to Polis Massa, that he was present in the facility, that he had remained throughout the emergency delivery to ensure her safety. She asked the droid to summon him, needing to know what had happened after she lost consciousness, dreading the answer but unable to continue without knowing. The droid departed silently, leaving her alone with the soft beeping of medical monitors and the weight of knowledge that her life had ended on Mustafar, even though her body continued functioning. Obi-Wan appeared minutes later, his face a landscape of grief that mirrored what Padmé felt internally. He looked a decade older than when she had last seen him, his eyes carrying the burden of having done something necessary but unforgivable. He told her what had happened after she collapsed, his voice flat and emotionless in the way of someone who had exhausted their capacity for feeling. He had fought Anakin across the mining facility, their duel eventually reaching the lava shores, where Obi-Wan had claimed the high ground. Anakin had attacked despite the disadvantage, arrogance, and dark side corruption overriding tactical sense. Obi-Wan had been forced to maim him, cutting away his legs and remaining organic arm, leaving him burning on the volcanic shore. Padmé listened to the description of her husband's mutilation with a strange sense of distance, as though Obi-Wan was describing events that had happened to strangers rather than people she knew and loved. She asked if Anakin was dead, part of her hoping for confirmation that would at least provide closure. But Obi-Wan didn't know. He had left Anakin burning, unable to watch or deliver a mercy killing to the brother he had raised and failed. Palpatine would almost certainly have sent forces to recover his new apprentice. If Anakin had survived, he would be more machine than man now, kept alive by technology and the dark side's refusal to release those who served it. She asked to see her children, needing something tangible and good to anchor herself against the tide of grief threatening to drown her. The medical droids brought 2 tiny bundles, each baby small enough to fit in one arm, their faces scrunched and red, their eyes closed in sleep. The boy had Anakin's features, his nose and chin unmistakable even in miniature. The girl had Padmé's elegance, her bone structure visible beneath infant softness. Looking at them, Padmé felt a complex surge of emotion, love and terror, and fierce protectiveness and guilt, that she had brought them into a galaxy where their father was a monster and their mother was broken. She named them lying in that medical bed, her voice gaining strength as she spoke the names that felt right in ways beyond explanation. Luke, for the light he would carry in a galaxy growing darker. Leia, for the strength she would need to survive what was coming. The names felt like promises, commitments to raise these children to be better than their circumstances, to give them chances at lives not defined by their parents' failures. But even as she named them, Padmé felt something cracking deeper inside her, a wound that medical technology couldn't address because it existed in the spirit rather than the body. Bail Organa arrived at Polis Massa shortly after, having fled Coruscant when the purge made remaining impossible. He came to the medical bay and looked at Padmé with such compassion that it almost broke through the numbness, insulating her from full emotional reality. He spoke to her about the necessity of hiding the children, of ensuring that Palpatine and whatever Anakin had become never learned of their existence. The twins would be targets if discovered, either killed as threats or corrupted as Anakin had been. They needed to be separated, hidden in different parts of the galaxy, raised by people who could protect them and prepare them for futures that might offer the galaxy hope when all seemed lost. Padmé understood the logic, even as her heart screamed against it. She had just given birth. These children had been inside her for months, their presence a constant reminder that something good could exist even in terrible times. The thought of giving them up, of not watching them grow, of surrendering them to strangers who would raise them with different names and different stories, felt like dying slowly rather than all at once. But Obi-Wan and Bail were right. The Empire would hunt these children if it knew they existed. Anakin had already shown he was willing to kill younglings. Why would his own children be exempt from his corrupted sense of necessity? Bail offered to take Leia to Alderaan, to raise her as his daughter alongside his wife Queen Breha, who had long wanted a child. She would grow up as a princess, educated and protected, given every advantage that one of the galaxy's wealthiest and most cultured worlds could provide. Obi-Wan suggested taking Luke to Tatooine, to Anakin's step-family who still worked their moisture farm in the desert. The boy would grow up humble and hidden, far from the Empire's centers of power, watched over distantly by Obi-Wan, who would make the desert world his exile. The locations made strategic sense, neither obvious enough to attract attention, but both capable of providing the protection and preparation the children would need. Padmé agreed because she had no choice, because refusing would mean condemning her children to death or worse. But agreeing meant acknowledging that her role in their lives was ending before it had properly begun, that she would not be the mother she had imagined being, that her children would grow up not knowing her except as history recorded her. She held them both one final time, memorizing their faces, whispering promises and apologies and love into their sleeping faces. She told Luke he had his father's spirit and hoped desperately it would lead him toward light rather than darkness. She told Leia she had her mother's strength and prayed it would be sufficient for the battles she would face. Then she let them go, placing each baby into the arms of those who would carry them away to opposite ends of the galaxy. The medical droids expressed concern about Padmé's vital signs, monitoring equipment showing declining function that had no clear physiological cause. Her injuries from the force choke were minor. The delivery had been successful. There was no infection, no hemorrhaging, no obvious medical crisis to explain why her body was shutting down, but Padmé understood what the droids couldn't measure. The medical term would eventually be recorded as losing the will to live, a diagnosis that sounded absurd and romantic until one understood that the will to live was not merely attitude but something fundamental, a force as real as gravity that kept spirit connected to flesh. When that will was sufficiently damaged, the body simply stopped fighting to continue. She was dying. Not from injuries, but from heartbreak, from the complete collapse of everything she had built her life around. The Republic was gone, transformed into an empire she didn't recognize. The Jedi were destroyed, their 1,000-year legacy reduced to rubble and propaganda. Anakin was gone, twisted into something evil that wanted to rule through fear and violence. Her children were being taken from her before she could know them. Democracy had died, love had become hatred, hope had curdled into despair. What purpose remained in continuing to breathe when breathing meant only witnessing more destruction? Part of her tried to fight against the dying, arguing that she owed it to Luke and Leia to survive, to be present in their lives somehow, to help shape the galaxy they would inherit. But that part was small and growing smaller, overwhelmed by the vast emptiness that had opened inside her. She was so tired of fighting losing battles in the Senate, tired of hiding her relationship, tired of watching Anakin change while pretending she didn't notice, tired of being strong when strength accomplished nothing. The temptation to simply surrender, to let go and find peace in whatever came after life, grew stronger with each labored breath. Obi-Wan sat beside her bed in those final hours. His presence a small comfort, though words had become impossible for both of them. They had both loved Anakin in different ways, and both had failed to save him from himself. They were united in grief and guilt, two survivors of a catastrophe that had destroyed their worlds. Padmé tried to speak, to ask Obi-Wan to tell the children about their father as he had been before the fall, to make sure they knew he hadn't always been a monster. But her voice wouldn't cooperate, the words dying before they reached her lips. Her last thoughts were not of the grand political principles she had devoted her life to defending, not of the Republic's fall or the Empire's rise, or the historical forces that had destroyed everything she loved. Instead, she thought of small moments. Anakin's smile when they had married in secret, the joy on his face unguarded and pure, the feeling of the twins moving inside her, tiny lives already displaying distinct personalities. The meadows of Naboo where she had walked as a child, the flowers blooming in colors that still seemed impossible, the sensation of purpose when giving a speech she believed in, words flowing from conviction rather than calculation, these small pieces of happiness scattered across a life that had held more than she had appreciated while living it. Padmé Amidala died on Polis Massa, mere minutes after her children were taken away to their separate destinies, her body finally surrendering to what her spirit had already accepted. The medical droids recorded the time and cause, their analysis noting the biological mystery of a patient dying despite all efforts to preserve her. Obi-Wan closed her eyes and allowed himself tears, grieving not just for Padmé, but for everything her death represented, the final extinguishing of the bright, hopeful era, when democracy and justice had seemed not just possible but inevitable. Her body was returned to Naboo for a state funeral, the arrangements overseen by loyal handmaidens who had served her since childhood. They prepared her carefully, placing her in a flowing gown that concealed her posthumously flattened belly, making her appear still pregnant to observers who would wonder what had happened to the child she had carried. This deception was intentional, a final misdirection to protect Luke and Leia by allowing the galaxy to believe they had died with their mother, erased before birth by the tragedy that had claimed Padmé's life. The funeral procession moved through Theed's streets lined with mourners, thousands who had loved their senator and former queen, who wept for the young woman who had represented the Republic's best qualities and whose death symbolized that Republic's murder. Anakin Skywalker, now more machine than man, sealed within armor that both sustained and tortured him, stood in a medical facility on Coruscant and learned of Padmé's death from the Emperor's lips. The news that she had died, that his visions had proven prophetic despite all his efforts to prevent them, that he had killed her in his anger exactly as foreseen, shattered what remained of the man inside the armor. His scream of anguish echoed through the facility, the force surging with such dark fury that equipment exploded and walls cracked. He had embraced darkness to save her. He had murdered and betrayed and corrupted himself to prevent her death, and his actions had accomplished nothing except ensuring the future he feared, creating the tragedy he had sold his soul to avoid. The galaxy moved on because galaxies always do, time flowing forward regardless of personal catastrophe. The Empire consolidated power, Palpatine's iron grip extending to every inhabited system. The surviving Jedi went into hiding, scattered across the outer rim, waiting for opportunities that seemed unlikely to materialize. Resistance cells formed and were crushed, their members executed as examples to discourage further rebellion, and somewhere, hidden on opposite ends of the galaxy, twins grew up never knowing their sister or brother existed, never understanding they were part of a legacy spanning generations, that their bloodline carried both the galaxy's greatest hope and its darkest shadow. Luke Skywalker grew strong under Tatooine's twin sons, his aunt and uncle raising him with love and caution, never telling him about the father who had become the Empire's most feared enforcer. Leia Organa grew up in Alderaan's palace, surrounded by beauty and privilege and the education of a diplomat and leader, her adoptive parents preparing her for greatness while hiding her true parentage. Both children carried their mother's courage and compassion, her commitment to justice and truth. Both carried their father's power in the Force, that Vergent's inheritance manifesting in abilities neither understood, but both felt in moments of intuition and connection to something larger than themselves. Padmé Amidala's legacy lived in her children, though they didn't know it, her spirit echoing across the years in every choice they made toward light rather than darkness, toward hope rather than despair. She had died believing herself a failure, her love corrupted, and her political work destroyed, unable to see that her greatest contribution would unfold over decades through the children she hadn't lived to raise. The tragedy of her final days would eventually become the foundation for the Empire's defeat, her twins growing into the leaders who would restore the Republic she had died defending. But in the moment of her death, she knew none of this. She died broken and grieving, believing that everything she had fought for was lost, that love had led only to destruction, that the galaxy she left behind was worse than the one she had entered. The profound sadness of Padmé's end lay not just in her death, but in its senselessness. She died from heartbreak that might have been prevented if Anakin had trusted her, if he had confided his fears, rather than acting on them secretly, if he had chosen their relationship over the promises of power offered by a manipulative Sith Lord. She died protecting children she barely knew from a threat created by the man she loved. Her final act, a mother's sacrifice to give her twins chances at lives she would never witness. She died as democracy died, both casualties of the same corruption, both extinguished by the same darkness masquerading as salvation. And she died alone in the ways that mattered most. Separated from her children and her husband, her ideals shattered, her hope exhausted, her heart simply unable to continue beating when beating meant only more pain. Legacy. Padmé Amidala's tragic final days represent one of the galaxy's great casualties, not of war, but of love corrupted by fear and ambition twisted into tyranny. Her death marked the end of the Republic's idealistic era, when senators believed in democracy as more than procedure, and when personal sacrifice for principles seemed worthwhile rather than futile. Yet her influence extended far beyond her abbreviated life through the twins she protected with her last acts. Luke and Leia, growing into the leaders who would eventually fulfill their mother's dreams by defeating the empire she died witnessing rise. History remembers her as a martyr to Republican values, a young leader whose courage and vision were destroyed by the darkness she tried to resist. The terrible irony was that she died from a broken heart caused by the man who had claimed he was doing everything to save her, Anakin's obsessive fear of loss creating the very catastrophe he sought to prevent. Padmé's legacy teaches that love without trust becomes possession, that fear corrupts even the purest intentions, and that sometimes the greatest contributions come through children who carry forward fights their parents couldn't win. She died, believing she had failed, never knowing she had given the galaxy its future hope, never seeing her daughter become a rebel leader and her son become the Jedi who would redeem his father and restore balance to the Force, vindicating everything Padmé had believed in during her final, heartbroken moments.